Mike. Hi, Mike Cook. Nice to see you.
Hello. How's it going?
Hi, Mike Cook. Nice to see you.
Hello. How's it going? Hello. How's it going?
Can the people online hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. We have a great setup here.
But not very loudly, Maya, so maybe.
It'll be better. There's just a lot of ambient noise right now. Could be 3 more minutes and then. I'm really excited. So I was going to ask the first question, give you a chance to introduce yourself. In about a minute. Give about a minute introduction. Or the first question. Is that all right? You can't hear me very well, can you? Okay.
It's not great.
All right, we'll be getting started here in a moment. Hi, everybody. I'd love to start settling into the panel, please. this is really exciting for me. I've been part of this community, the International Conference on Computational Creativity, since 2015, before generative AI was a thing, when it was kind of a well-kept secret, if you will. And since November, there has been this massive popularization of generative AI, which positions our community in a very different light. It sort of really changes the game. So I thought that this was a great moment to have a panel that brings in people who view generative AI in particular from different perspectives and see how we can essentially expand the reach of our community, our way of thinking, by considering these different perspectives. So I have with me today here people who bring in perspectives from ethics, from venture funding, from academia, and from computational creativity. And we're all gonna mostly focus on the same questions in order to kind of create a more complete picture of what generative AI is in the world at large from the perspective of different stakeholders. And then there's going to be a chance to ask quite a few questions as well. Okay, so we're going to start by asking everybody on the panel to introduce themselves and also share how they first learned about creative machines and what got them interested in this topic. So we can go in whichever order. Maybe we could start with Irina.
Of course, I had just muted myself, so of course you would start with me. Hi, everybody. My name is Irina Raicu. I'm the director of the Internet Ethics Program at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University in Silicon Valley. And I love the question about how I first started getting interested in all of this, because I should say I do not have in any way a technical background. My background is in law and literature, which does mean I care a lot about creativity and a lot about writing. But I started to get interested a while back when we were talking about things like deep fakes and about, let's say, around the time of GPT-2 on whether it should, or at the time, yeah, it was GPT-2. There was a whole debate about whether it should be released or not, whether it was too dangerous to be released. I don't know if you remember that. But basically, a machine learning expert's blog post from February 2019 was titled "OpenAI Trains Language Model, Mass Hysteria Ensues." So that might have a familiar ring to it. It was around that time that the same expert was telling me about deep fakes. We used to refer to generative AI in terms of images of human beings as deep fakes. That seems to have fallen out of favor. And we actually pulled together at the center where I work a compendium that we called Readings in AI Ethics, because we thought there were enough issues, again, in 2019, that we should start talking about it and teaching about it. And we actually, in May 2020, we had an event with engineering students at Santa Clara that was around an ethics case study called "To Release or Not to Release GPT-2 Synthetic Text Generator." Because again, generative AI sounds very nice, but it's a relatively new term, right? We used to call it synthetic stuff, and we used to just use other terms. So anyway, it's been a while that I've been interested in this, and I'm really looking forward to how everybody else came to this moment.
Well, thank you. Minda, would you like to go next? Oh, Minda, we can't hear you. You might be muted. Yeah.
Thank you. Rookie mistake. My name is Minda Bruce, and I am one of the founding partners of First Row Partners. We're based here in Seattle, Washington, and we make pre-seed software investments all over the US. And a big part of our thesis is AI. And so we've been making investments in that since 2019, 2020, and continue on that track. I also have an opportunity, which is really always exciting because I get to be around a lot of emerging ideas and thinkers at the University of Washington, teaching a graduate level class in angel investing, where we really focused on AI during the last quarter because all the students were hearing so much about it through, whether it was popular media or through the deals that we were screening for the $50,000 a year that we invest through that class. So we had a lot of really interesting discussions because we had some attorneys or law school students in the room, PhDs, a really interesting cross-section to talk about AI with. So that's my most recent experience. I think the first time I can really kind of remember coming into contact with it was one of the Y Combinator is one of these big accelerators down in the Bay Area. And they all of a sudden started turning out all these generative AI companies that sort of happened all at once. And through that, we got to meet a company that we invested in. And one of those two founders actually subsequently left and went to OpenAI. But learning through him and learning through my founders, frankly, has been one of the most interesting ways to think about the applications that they can do today and what's relevant today and commercializing things for now, but also really how that projects into the future and what their perspective is on where things will be in 10 years and how things will look then. So learning through my founders has been, and my students, has been sort of my entry point into my point of view on all this.
Great. Thanks so much, Minda. David, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just an intro to myself. Sort of master's in mathematics from the University of Waterloo, actually, where this is being hosted. I'm sort of started in this field, I guess, in 2015. That's sort of where Dr. Meyer Ackerman actually introduced me to the notion of computational creativity and what it means for a machine to be creative and whether a machine can be creative. What is creativity? And I think as we've kind of gone through and sort of researched in that particular vein of whether a machine can be creative, the things that interest me the most is how do we help human beings be more creative? How do we help humans access sort of latent creativity that they might have or things that they might want to do, but maybe lack the skill set involved? And so my background is in building systems and building machine learning systems at scale and sort of delivering them at scale. And so I tackle the problem from the practical perspective of, okay, I want to build this system. How do I do that? And how do I tackle these challenges? And can we do that? And should we do that in some cases? And so that's been interesting for me is I come from the perspective of trying to help people. And so I'm always looking at it through that particular lens. That's sort of my entry point into generative AI has just always been, how do I build a machine to help people? And I think as we're going through, last year, as we saw, ChatGPT and GPT-3 and so on has been building and building and building. And we, as a result of all the PR and whatnot around that, as suddenly this term generative AI came out and became part of the sort of the social consciousnness, it's been very interesting to see the amount of money, I guess, that's been pouring into this field. And I think at this point, it's interesting how frequently things are changing. And I think for me, it's a very interesting moment in time. And I think it could go any number of ways. And I'm interested to hear today how other people are sort of seeing that from their perspectives. And I think it's going to be very interesting.
Right. Thank you, David. Mike, the person that most people in the audience know.
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, my name's Mike Cook. I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London here in the UK. And yeah, I guess I got into this quite a while ago. I started my PhD in late 2010, and pretty much from the start, I was working on computational creativity for game design. So I built systems that could design games, to model the game design process, understand generative content. So this is before the current wave of AI hype kind of came along, before anyone was interested even in games as a topic. We were still interested in generative systems because it was very applicable to the games industry. It was enabling new kinds of game experience. So I've been here watching first the wave of games hype come, then the AI hype to follow it. Now we're in the generative hype. And it's been an interesting decade, I guess. It's been an interesting 10 years to kind of watch all of this grow and evolve. Today, I'm focused on still building AI systems that can help analyze and assess and expand and create in games. But lately, I've become especially interested in what happens when this technology actually comes into contact with the games industry. How can we build it in a way that people want, people feel safe and happy using, that actually enhances people's experiences, whether that's professional jobs or hobbyists? And how do we avoid some of the kind of worse aspects of the technology?
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike. As you can see, we have people here bringing very different perspectives to generative AI. So the next question is actually going to be a different question for each person, so they can help flesh out this multidimensional entity that is generative AI. We're actually going to start with Mike. You could succinctly, if it's possible, to succinctly differentiate between computational creativity and generative AI, perhaps similarities and differences.
Yeah, this is a tricky one to answer, because I think a lot of different people in the room might have different answers to this or might disagree. I was thinking about this today, and I think the way I would put it is something which would be familiar to lots of people who've been to this conference over the years, which is that computational creativity is interested kind of in every part of the creative process, whereas generative AI is mostly concerned with what comes out. What is the final product? As long as the final product is of value and of interest, then generative AI can work with that. That doesn't mean that it's the only thing that they care about. That might be part of, someone's daily workflow and things like that. But that's the thing that they want to get right. Whereas computational creativity is about asking additional questions that maybe are not always of top concern otherwise. Things like, do people actually believe the system is creative? Is it engaging in the way that we would expect a creative system to engage? That's how I think about the distinction. And that distinction has been for us, like, going back quite a long way to the origins of this field of research. So I was really interested in that kind of philosophy. But I don't know. I think maybe these days people feel very differently about generative AI. And I haven't been to ICCC in a couple of years, and I know that our relationship with it has definitely changed a lot in the last couple of years. So there might be some disagreements on this panel, even with that comparison.
No, I think that you differentiated the two fields incredibly well. Thank you for that. The next question is for David. So what does it take to commercialize generative AI?
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of things. I think first and foremost, when it comes to the idea of using generative AI to come up with some commercial product, first question is obviously who are you trying to help with it, right? So unless you have untold amounts of money and you're going to build a new foundational model that you don't even know what it's going to be used for, generally speaking, you're going to sit there and you're going to have to come up with some use case or some sort of need, some real world challenge that people are facing, that you think, if I use maybe one of these foundational models, I can either fine tune it, or I can use prompt engineering to try and help fix that, or sort of fundamentally shift that particular problem and make people more useful. And in some cases, like coding, for example, if I want to build that, how do I go about doing that? Or for me, it's music. Like, how do I help a human being express themselves through music? And I think, given the number of foundational models that are out there, there's so many interesting ways now that you can prototype and come out with new projects and get them out the door. The main thing is whether or not you're actually solving, like I said, a real world problem. And I think that's, when it comes to commercialization, I think the barrier to entry has been lowered dramatically as a result of the amount of money that's been flooding into the space. That is going to lead, I think, to a lot of problems, and we can get into that later. But for now, I think that sort of barrier to entry has dropped significantly compared to what it was maybe even just a year ago. It's dropped a lot.
Right, thank you. The next question is for Minda. What do investors look for when considering opportunities in generative AI? And you can comment on it broadly, but it'd also be wonderful if you bring in your own unique perspective. I believe that you're muted again.
Got it. Okay. When I think about it from an investment perspective, I think it really kind of is a continuation of David's answer, which is that the barrier to entry has been lowered significantly. And the ability to leverage a foundational model means that you can do something relatively lightweight and quick on top to show off the capacity of this foundational model, which is maybe sort of tuned or directed in some way toward a problem and produces a really outstanding result, which can look like you're creating a huge amount of value, but really the part that you've built is relatively easily replaced and sort of easily commoditized. So I think I've seen a lot of sort of quick hit pop-up opportunities happen. And I think that then there are the ones that I find more intriguing for the long-term investment, which is really around the team who is conceiving of solving a problem. And that what they're doing is they're using AI as an opportunity to create a whole experience for either a workflow or a decision being made or some is as part of some larger context and process. And I think when it's understood in that capacity, you have the opportunity to gather and build proprietary data sets and smaller models that are more likely to, I think, generate long-term opportunities for distribution and value building that I find more investable. So those are sort of there's a signal and noise thing going on right now. And to me, a lot of the noise is everybody coming out with a co-pilot for anything, or just the ability to sort of make yourself faster at doing today's work. When I think the real opportunity is in re-envisioning what we're able to do because of AI. And I think that takes a really thoughtful, insightful individual who really understands a certain area. A problem, decision, et cetera, and uses AI in a different way that I find sort of like is just like the next level up of opportunity.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. That was incredibly helpful and comprehensive. All right. So we have AI now out in the wild, lots of investments being made. I would love for Irina to comment on some of the greatest ethical challenges and opportunities that are brought by this wave of generative AI.
Thank you. So, okay, I'm going to start with the challenges, and I kept myself to a list of 8 because I didn't want to overwhelm or terrify people further. And by the way, if I'm looking, you see me looking down, is because this is my creativity aid. I don't know if you can see it. It's a notepad. It works really well for me, even if it doesn't show on Zoom quite that well. So some of the ethical challenges that are specific, I think, to generative AI. One is, at least in terms of certain kinds of visuals and in terms of text, that the appearance of accuracy and logic when in fact it doesn't have that, and how misleading that can be to people. I think that we've seen that can be a huge, is a huge challenge. Second, the appearance of comprehensiveness. The fact that a lot of these tools, and again, I'm thinking of chatbots now, are trained on a subset of the internet, and the internet is only a subset of knowledge. And we have to keep that in mind. I was thinking about this, and I realized that it's also generally public data, and that, for example, love letters are generally not public, but obituaries are. And if you have a tool that ingests a lot of obituaries and then you ask it to write you a love letter, you might not get the best results, right? But this is kind of what we're doing now. We have this tool that has ingested a particular subset of kinds of information, and we're trying to use it for everything. Another ethical challenge, a huge one, and I was just reading about that today, is the hidden, under-rewarded labor of humans like data labelers. There's a great article today called AI is a Lot of Work, and it refers to what it calls the, quote, vast tasker underclass. We have a vast tasker underclass developing. This is a huge challenge. The fourth one is the issue that most people by now have probably heard about, which are the biases ingested, encoded, and perpetuated or amplified by some of these tools. Fifth challenge would be the environmental impact. I really wish that every time somebody would say, draw me Winnie the Pooh in the style of Kandinsky, they would think, well, this has some environmental cost. There are data centers that have to collect all and store all the data and their energy used in creating all of these things that we play with. I'm not saying we shouldn't use that. I'm saying we need to be conscious of that. The sixth one would be the potential pollution of an already murky knowledge commons, that if we generate a lot of AI stuff and we feed it back into the internet and then we ingest it back in future models, we might ruin all of this if we're not careful, or at least the next generation of all of these tools if we're not careful. Number 7 would be the lack of understanding of such tools among people in position to push for their adoption in high stakes scenarios. That again, because of the hype, people now want these tools integrated into everything, including lots of places where they don't belong. And number 8 is the overly broad conversations about AI risks, because AI risks are very contextual. So we cannot just have a broad conversation about AI risks. Okay, that's my list of 8. I could go on, but I will stop there because I think that gives us plenty to think about. There are lots of opportunities, and I think other people in the group are probably more likely to talk about the opportunities than me. And sometimes I come in and I talk about all the harms just because that's the part that we hear about less. But I think the opportunities arise in all kinds of situations that we don't hear about. And these are, I would say, I'm not an expert at the sort of creative AI side, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from those of you who are. But in terms of AI in general, the ability to use all kinds of data that is not personal data, that is not going to give us predictions about human beings, but is going to look at atmospheric data or industrial Internet of Things data or oceanic data and do things like actually help us address some of the environmental challenges, for example, or help us find, negative interactions between drugs and avoid them, things like that. I think the opportunities are huge with AI in general and with generative AI. I think we just have to really figure out where it belongs and where it doesn't, and just use it wisely.
Right. Thanks so much, Irina, for the comprehensive answer. So I'd like to remind everybody in the audience that there will be plenty of time to ask questions. So please start thinking about what you'd like to learn more about. I'm going to skip ahead a bit in my list because there are some things that I consider particularly important. So we'll go to number 4. From your standpoint, who are the most important stakeholders in your space? Who are the people who are actually shaping what's going on in industry, academia, venture, and the ethical dimension of generative AI and creative machines in general? So maybe we'll start with David with industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people know OpenAI has been shaping the industry pretty rapidly recently, and I think they will continue to do so. There are a number of other companies in the space. Obviously, Google is going to have a massive role to play, and I think that they're going to continue to push things forward. I think Microsoft, obviously through OpenAI, has been pushing things quite dramatically. And as it continues, those players are going to try and consolidate some of the things that they're doing and trying to sort of stay ahead of everyone else. I think the most interesting thing that's going to shift, I believe, over the next couple of years is the open source version of all of these things. Meta recently has said that they're going to release their larger language models just freely to use commercially and otherwise as open source. And their vantage point is that they want industry adoption as well as innovation to sort of speed up. And I think it's an interesting turning point where people are starting to think of the open source models are going to be as good as the commercial models are right now, probably in 6 months. And so you're you don't really have a moat from an industry perspective to rest on when it comes to these foundational models. So I think as we move forward, I think that's the most interesting thing for me. Those players are going to broaden, and it's going to be just the general public of people who are interested in building these systems. And then it just comes down to, again, we're talking about environmental impact. We're going to have a lot of people who are trying to build and fine tune these models and whatnot, and they cost a lot. They take a lot of energy. They take a lot of, resources when it comes to this, as we saw, from crypto using a lot of resources. This is going to blow up at some point, and it's going to start to consume quite a lot when it comes to the environmental impact. But this whole space is very interesting, and I think the big players, although they've been extremely necessary for making this thing into what it is today, I think that when it comes to their influence, it's going to be more on, they're going to be with the government trying to figure out what are the rules around this. We saw Sam Altman on sort of a Senate Judiciary Committee, or not Judiciary, but a Senate Committee, giving his testimony around what he thinks that should be. And I think, they're going to have a lot to play in that. And I think that could shape things well, but it could also do a lot of harm when it comes to trying to shut down potentially the open source community and saying, you can't do this. That could consolidate power in a very few number of companies. And that's a little scary to me. I think that idea that Google, Meta, and maybe OpenAI and Microsoft are the only people who are allowed to build these models because they're the only people who can have the money and resources necessary to fill all the necessary paperwork out when it comes to, applying for the permits and whatever else to build these models. That's going to be, as we know, when you put all the data and everything in one of these companies, there's going to be ethical concerns, and that's scary to me. But I'm hopeful that things will pan out.
Great, thank you, David. Definitely, the largest companies have been working very hard to take a lead on generative AI. On the other side, you have the players that are smaller right now, and even some companies that haven't been born yet, who are seeking funding. So, as far as where the money is at, Minda, could you please tell us a little bit about the landscape of the biggest players investing in generative AI?
I'm sure that just in a heartbeat, a ton of venture capital firms changed their website to say, we're very excited about Web3 and to we're very excited about AI and right. So I think there are probably a lot of investors who changed their focus really quickly to just sort of capture this moment. And I think that to some degree, that's really what investors do, is they look at where things are going, where the smart people are forming companies, teams, and innovation, and they get there as fast as they can. And I think other folks have been there a bit longer, right? And so I think that there are some really thoughtful people within venture firms that have been maybe coming through more the like deeply technical side and into these VC firms who are really sort of defining some direction. And they're probably clashing with some of the folks that chase the hype. So those are some of the characteristics that I've observed. And then there are a whole bunch of investor tinkerers, I would say, and I find them an interesting group because they're sort of out there now that this has been so easy to build, easy to do, easy to show something, that a lot of folks are getting a lot of attention for just sort of building little experiments and things and sort of galvanizing people's interest around their community, their resources, putting the spotlight on themselves through just kind of tinkering, because there is so much sort of, with generative AI, you can generate a lot of things and show pictures and music or assets and things like that, that really sort of create a lot of attention. So, as a type of sort of people in the ecosystem, investors are spotlight seekers, and we're chasing the ones that are doing the really smart stuff. So I think that it's important to understand sort of like how and why that money flows in that direction and pivots so quickly into it and out of areas that had been getting a lot more attention previously. And I do find it really interesting too to see the folks that have been really in more academic settings up to this point sort of find their day out pairing with business people to really introduce some solutions that are really timely. And so I've seen that there's been more of an embrace more than ever in this, sort of software space in bringing academics in, whereas traditionally I feel like that's been in the hard sciences. And so those are just some of the things I'm observing in my own investor community. And I think everyone's trying to find out the big question, which is, where are the defensible investments that we can make? Where is there going to be something we can invest in that, OpenAI doesn't make some new announcement and just swamp everything we just invested in and make it irrelevant. Things are becoming sort of commoditized and scooped up so quickly. It's a question of, are the incumbents going to be the winners, or will there be some upstart winners? And in what areas will those be? So I think we're all sort of continually refining our thesis on that.
It's very interesting. Thank you, Minda. So, Mike, are you willing to share to an academic community who are the biggest stakeholders in generative AI in academia? Perhaps I didn't consider that might be an uncomfortable question.
Of course, all of the people who are in the room with you right now, Maya. I mean, I can't see them, but I'm pretty sure all of the names I have written down here are them. No, I'd actually written down, funnily enough, I'd written down a number of people who were not in academia, because I thought about about the people, the stakeholders who interact with research, and like the ones who sort of I see in my day-to-day life. But I think it links to talking about influence in academia. So I'm gonna rattle off some of these names anyway, and many of them are researchers. So one of the things that I've been reflecting on, and actually links to what Minda and David have said, is that it's kind of we've gone past the point where there's like a nice discussion between everyone in the AI space. There are now a few entrenched leaders who are calling the shots, and as an academic, you can either work with them or you can try and do something different. And some of the most inspiring stuff I see is people trying to educate, make access to technology, to bring knowledge about AI, creativity, and digital tools to wider audiences. So I'm thinking of people like Kate Compton, V. Buckingham, Max Kreminsky, people who are building creative tools, creative systems, ways for people to engage with some of this technology and play with it and realize that it's safe and that they can have fun with it. I wanted to mention Alina Chia, who's a researcher at Goldsmiths. I think she's been doing really groundbreaking work into the impact of generative AI on the creative industries. I'm a huge fan of her. If you're in the UK, she's got an event at Goldsmiths at the end of this month, start of next month kind of thing. On a similar note, like Jamie Woodcock's doing really interesting studies into like digital labor and the effect that generative AI is having on those spaces. I picked out a couple of people who are kind of academic links to industry. So the Write with Leica team, so that's Charlene Putney and Martin Pichelmeyer. I think they're a great example of using generative AI in a way that really engages with and respects creative people. So writers are encouraged to train small systems on their own work and then talk with those systems and have a kind of creative conversation with them. Really, really nice work. And Doigu Chakmak, who works at Creative Assembly, I think is a great example of someone in the industry who's got a lot of business sense of what problems need solving, but also a lot of empathy and humanity and an understanding that these are real people's jobs and lives at stake. So these are just some of the people who are kind of in conversations with academics a lot and whose work I really respect. And I'd be remiss if I didn't shout out some of my own students, which is horribly biased of me, but they are honestly, I think they are doing some of the most exciting work out there. So people like Eunice Rabi, Florence Smith-Nichols, Amy Smith, like all of these people are taking this technology and finding completely new ways to apply it. And they're taking this kind of nimble approach where they look for things which are completely unattractive to big corporations, going in a completely different direction, and that always produces exciting stuff. So these are some of the people who are inspiring me right now. I hope that's the kind of answer you wanted, Maya. And obviously, again, as mentioned, everyone who is listening to this right now, that goes without saying.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, great. So we had Irina comment on some of the greatest threats quite comprehensively and as well as some of the greatest opportunities. I was wondering if other people on the panel would like to comment on some of the greatest opportunities that have not been covered, and perhaps any threats that were not on Irina's list. But I guess
Hang on, Maya, I don't get to talk about stakeholders.
Oh, I'm sorry, Irina.
I
Please go
want to
ahead.
talk about stakeholders too.
Please, yeah.
I'll make it fast because I'm not going to start naming AI ethicists, although I can just as an aside name Shannon Valor, who is now at the University of Edinburgh, but she was my colleague at Santa Clara for many years and is amazing. So if you're not familiar with her work in AI ethics, look her up. But I was actually thinking, first of all, of some broad categories of key stakeholders in this area. And some folks we haven't mentioned, but who are key stakeholders, are the people whose creative or personal output was used as training data. I think they are key stakeholders in our conversation. And I should have added that to the ethical challenges part. The AI experts themselves who need to explain it to all the rest of us are key stakeholders in the way they might not appreciate that they need to become public speakers and public educators, because they need to influence another set of key stakeholders on my list, which are the lawmakers and regulators. Without those two groups talking to each other, we're going to have a lot of problems. And then another group, again, I'm biased as well. I am a lawyer by training and I work in an educational institution. So I will say lawyers and educators are key stakeholders, because the lawyers are filing lawsuits right now around, say, copyright issues, which are going to have huge impact on everything we're talking about. And the educators are struggling with how to integrate this into their classes, how to explain it to their students, and also how to educate the next generation of AI researchers themselves, right? So these are really powerful stakeholder groups. And then just because people were sort of naming names, I want to name 3 organizations that if you're not familiar with, you might want to keep an eye on. One is the Partnership on AI. It has some great resources. One is an organization called Data and Society in the US, and a third one is the AI Now Institute. And you might not agree with their perspectives on things, but if you look at their websites, you will find a lot of really useful information about a lot of the things that we're talking about.
Great, thanks so much, Irina. And this was, I'm really glad that you reminded me that we needed stakeholders on that front as well. And thanks also for tying it together, pointing out something that we as academics can do to help this whole ecosystem form, hopefully in the right direction. So for the next question, I'd love for everybody who hasn't had a chance to comment on the greatest opportunities to highlight what you in particular are most excited about with the emergence of creative machines. So maybe we could start with Minda.
Great. Yeah, I am really interested in opportunities where the AI and sort of like all the machined perfection of creating all these sort of shaving off all the rough edges of things by sort of synthesizing output or sort of creating a non-real thing that maybe feels real, where it intersects and supports actual human output creativity and sort of that ingenuity, sort of what makes us delight in things is the character, the story, and it's the broken pieces. And those things are not well handled by technology. And so when I sit at the intersection of those things, it's not about like replacing a person with a robot, but it's about sort of this, how the opportunity of technology supports letting the human do the human things. And so I guess what I'm hoping at the end of the day is that tech will make us allow us to be more human. And all those flaws and irregularities, we get to sort of let those fly and use the support of AI and technology to really sort of be a platform. So that's I see things like that in being able to make the computer surfaces that we interact with more human-like, or just easier for humans to access in some way. So I'm looking for the AI to kind of not be present and be sort of background, and that humans get to come forward and the creativity gets to show. So those are the things where I look for opportunity long-term.
Thank you so much for sharing that. AI that makes us more human. I mean, what's a better vision than that? And it's great that there are people in the investment ecosystem who really look for the co-creativity angle. I think that's worth highlighting for the research community here. All right, Mike, did you want to add what you're most excited about?
I think there's a couple of things for me. One is that I want to point out that kind of, if you go back to the history of games, generative systems weren't used to replace things that humans were already doing. They were used to enable new kinds of experience. So Mark Twain, in his essay kind of criticizing Western RPGs, like he points out that procedural generation kind of revolutionized game design and was able to produce all of these amazing independent game experiences. So I'm interested in generative AI making things that couldn't be possible before, not kind of just doing the things that we've already been doing again. And the other thing I'm really interested in is at the other end, not at the big commercial end, but one of the most important things kind of in my life has been the creative communities I've been a part of. I've actually got some of my crochet on the desk with me, and I go to this new community. I've only been going to see them for a few weeks. And that means so much to me. And what I want to do is see AI systems support those communities all around the world, doing some of the labor that it takes to keep a creative community alive, critique, feedback, support, organization. And I think AI can be a real big part of that and just help support everyday creativity too. So those are my two big things, I think.
Great, thank you. David, did you want to share next what you're most excited about?
Yeah, I think what I'm most excited about is the co-creative aspect of generative AI. And I think the idea of creating things that couldn't be created is also very exciting to me. And I think I come at it from the music perspective because that's what I'm interested in working on. It's what I've been working on for 8 years now. But it's always been for me, how do I, people who want to engage in music. Music's such a fundamentally human thing. It's something that 97% apparently of people will try and play an instrument at some point in their lives. Like, people really, really want to engage with music, but it's such a hard thing to engage with when it comes to creation, because there's so many skills that you need just to be able to express yourself. And I think for me, the opportunity that I'm most excited about is the idea that whatever I have in my head, if I want to express pain, if I want to express joy, if I want to express sadness, being able to do that in any medium that I choose, without sort of having to sort of learn a whole bunch of things first. It's such a cathartic thing to be able to experience. And I think generative AI and just creative machines in general can help with that. And I think that's a better world to live in, where human beings can be more human, or it can be more creative, because I think creativity and creation in that respect is very human. I'm also very interested in the idea of creating things that couldn't possibly have been created. I think you could create entire worlds of NPCs or non-player characters that are just completely generative, and you could have a completely unique experience. Your experience could be completely different than someone else's, completely tailored to you depending on how you interact with the system. And I think that is extremely exciting, and not something that has been possible even outside of the idea of being able to talk to a machine. Has not really been something that's been very useful up until recently. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, from music, from games, from art in general, just to help people be creative. And that's what excites me. And that's what, that's the things that I want to build.
Wonderful. A lot of support for co-creativity. We had a session earlier today all about co-creativity.
There's one more opportunity that we haven't mentioned that I think is really interesting. It's in fact, we're in fact being forced to take on this opportunity to think about what creativity even means in the first place. what do we mean by creativity? What are the things that we're trying to save for human beings versus the things that we want to automate, right? That there is an opportunity that's being opened by these tools to really think deeply about some of the things that we were just kind of taking for granted until now. And I'm seeing that conversation develop, but I think it's really important because it gets us to something else that we've been hinting at, which is, you know, how do we build things that are good for people and that encourage creativity as opposed to the opposite, right? So we have the opportunity to really think deeply about that.
No, that's a really interesting point. What should we not automate? Where should creative machines not go? Kind of brings to mind online dating, right? And kind of the fallout from that, where at least there are at least some negative consequences. So it's that's a really interesting question, and I think I haven't seen much discussion about it. Mike, have you seen any discussion in academia around that?
About what shouldn't be automated?
Yes.
I think I wrote down some concerns I had earlier. I don't know if this is exactly leading into the next question, but I mean, the things that I noted down were things like concern about homogenization, about narrowing creativity. A lot of people I know are using ChatGPT to code, which is great if it enables them to do things they couldn't do before. But if we completely lose connection to the feeling of failing, the feeling of learning things from people, the feeling of trying things ourselves, I don't actually know what that's going to do to the creative space in 20, 30, 40 years' time. And that's why I really like a lot of the kind of independent spaces I see that are still keeping these things alive and encouraging people to understand what they're doing. I think obviously I'm concerned about the labor markets. Again, I mentioned Alina Chia earlier in this talk. She's written an amazing paper about the stratification of the creative industries that the generative AI is looking to cause. And I think also centralization of power, which David talked about earlier, like we're at risk of handing over control of our creative lives to a handful of companies, even more so than we already do. And I think Irina's point about what we value is really interesting. And I think there is a lot of value in talking about what creativity means to us. The problem is that isn't actually the conversation we're having a lot of the time. What we're having is actually a conversation about what can make money. And that is a big worry for me as well. Because right now, we don't have any time to really talk to people about whether they want these changes. The changes are just coming. And that's why we're having this panel today, is because, oh my God, what's happened in the last 12 months? So what I hope is that we can educate people and give them back a feeling of a voice. Every conversation I have with journalists or really anyone begins with them saying, I'm stupid, or I don't know anything, or, you know, a journalist told me this morning, I'm really dense, so, you know, explain to me this thing. And it's like, no, you're not. You've just been convinced that you don't know about any of this stuff. Like, we need to give everyone back the feeling that they have an opinion and a voice about all of this stuff, because it's going to affect their lives. So that's the big thing for me, I think, is empowering people so that they can push back against the things that they don't want. So rather than me telling you what shouldn't happen, it's about getting everyone else to tell you.
Getting more voices in the conversation. I agree. I think that's very important. And thanks for bringing up some other very real risks, like entropying our creativity. Kind of like young people don't know how to spell anymore. They don't have to. So it's a legitimate issue to pause on. Big picture, what's going to happen to human creativity? Is it really going to move forward? Or is there going to be some loss in the process as well? So maybe briefly, if anybody wants to comment on any great risks that nobody else touched on. Linda, did you have something there?
Yeah, something came to mind as I was listening to Mike talk about, you know, is think about what we do or don't want built, right? We think about from my perspective, who's holding the capital, who's allocating the capital. And that's a very homogenous group of people who believe genuinely that they speak for everyone and have felt empowered to speak for everyone for a very long time. And there is a real problem with sort of where the capital flows as to what is going to get funded and what perspective is going to get funded on this. And so I see that as a real risk, that we've failed to diversify and make that those capital allocators look like the rest of the world. And so when the world gets built for the people who are having that capital flow, we sort of continue to concentrate on a very sort of continued hierarchy of social, racial, economic dominance that just sort of like just keeps things locked in place. Like when I listened to a group of men talking about shopping, who were talking about technology, and really their version of the very best way that shopping could work is things just magically showed up at your door. You didn't know you wanted, but now you need it. It was all just like, and I said, does anyone enjoy shopping? Do you? And they were like, no, it's terrible. I was like, well, there's also like a social element to it that some people find that what you consider like work and labor and things you want automated away from you, some people find that to be a social experience. And they just literally were like, I was like, okay, so it's when you empower a certain group of people, the perspective, they just sometimes don't even know how to ask all the questions because they just can't see a wide enough perspective.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's the really major risk. The fact that most of the money lays in the hands that tend to have fairly uniform values and fairly uniform ways of understanding the world. It was actually very shocking to me when generative AI blew up in November, how a lot of the conversations in the startup ecosystem about it and what we're seeing out in the world really mirrors the values of the people who hold the money. And one thing that I really wonder, maybe kind of an impromptu question, is, what can academics do to try to, I guess, mitigate some of that, to try to bring in, to try to take things in a direction that we consider positive, which ties right into my last question. But first, David, did you want to slide anything else about greatest risks?
Yeah, I think that was a really interesting point that Minda just brought up. But we see it in our particular space all the time. Is it's always going towards the easy route, or what they perceive to be sort of the thing that's going to make the money the fastest, regardless of whether they can't perceive of, for example, this happens to us all the time, is they can't perceive of a world where people would want to make music or create something that's not for sale. That is mind-blowing to me, because music is something that you do so often, and yet we had this conversation with a particular venture capitalist that was their mind was blown at the idea that someone would spend money on something to create something and not want to get something back out of it other than the creation. And I was just flabbergasted that was something that was unknown. It's so many people engage in creation in so many levels without ever wanting something in return. They're doing it because they like it. Similar to shopping, some people do it because it's an enjoyable experience. I have like 3 guitars. I spent untold amounts of money on music. I have never tried to make money off of my music. I do it because it makes me feel good, right? And ultimately, that is a reward in and of itself, and that's fundamentally very interesting. When it comes to what I perceive to be some of the biggest threats right now that I'm seeing, is I really don't like what's going on when it comes to the artists. I'm really concerned for musicians, for people who are painters and things like this. They're allowed to copy people's styles and use their names in ways that I find extremely unethical and very harmful to real people's lives and their ability to provide for themselves. I mean, if I can create 1 million images at the click of a button in a particular living artist style, and they're making a living on that, suddenly searching for that artist's work becomes this impossible task because Google can't distinguish the difference. And so you have real problems there. And I think for me, figuring out what is allowed and what's not allowed, and that conversation with along those lines is going to be very precarious. Going down this route, we don't want to go down the route where only one company can afford to build a model and everybody else is gone, so that we have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. But we also don't want a world where I can just create something and not have to ever pay any artist ever again. There's got to be a balance in there, and that's why personally I focus on machines that help people. But yeah, that's very concerning for me.
mean, David, my hope is that the backlash is that we realize how much we value original things, and that we start to see the difference and start to think of, like Mike's crochet, and we start to really get the value in something handmade with on the actual brushstroke of the artist. And I want to see that maybe there is a backlash to that. Maybe our humanity surges forward when we start seeing that, because honestly, like, a copy is just not as interesting as an original to me. I guess maybe, and that's sort of my value system, but I feel like collectively, aren't we all going to react in some way and say—
We are, and I think we're starting down that path of reaction, right? The question is where it's going to land, because if during that time it completely makes someone's livelihood disappear, it might not happen fast enough for a lot of people, and that's really sad to me. That I've spent
waves of that with technology and automation, right? Is sort of the destruction of some of the status quo creators or entrepreneurs, et cetera. I think in that, I believe that can definitely be a story that gets repeated.
Yeah, for sure.
Position time is definitely going to be the biggest challenge, and it's kind of interesting to ponder where things are going to land. Yeah, I really like these hypotheses. So this, Irina, did you want to add anything else around greatest threats?
You don't want to get me started. No. I think the whole conversation, hit all of the main things.
Well, in that case, you can lead us into the next question. That is really sort of the purpose of this discussion in some sense. What would it take for creative machines to make a positive impact on humanity and minimize risks? Essentially, what do you think we should do? So I'd love for you to comment on, those who feel comfortable commenting on what academics can maybe do to get involved, to try to shape things in the right direction, but also other stakeholders. What do you think investors should do? What do you think companies should do? What do you think people around ethics should do? So Irina, if you please lead us in that direction.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, just the question you asked about who are the key stakeholders. If every person who is involved in any way with generative AI would take a couple of minutes to sit down and try to identify who they see as key stakeholders, who are the people and the groups who are going to be impacted by this. And then take their list and talk to other people, because it's always really useful to get other people's perspectives, and you always find that your stakeholder list is much too short. That opens up the conversation in a way where otherwise we're all sort of reacting to this speed with which the developments come at us. And so everything is reactive. We really need to take a little bit of time and not just react to the next story, but think more broadly. And thinking about the stakeholders is one of the ways to think more broadly about the whole impact. Another thing I would say is, to Minda's point, cross-perspective and multidisciplinary conversations are really, really useful. And, I think Mike was saying that some of these conversations about creativity are not happening in academia. They are happening probably in some departments. I know that they are happening in some departments and maybe not in others. And so I just want to put in a plug for something that we have at Santa Clara University. We have something called the Tech Ethics Faculty Group. And it gets together, I don't know, maybe 4 times a year. We pick a topic. But the people who come to talk about a tech ethics related topic might be from the music department, from the psychology department, from the English department, from business, from law. And so you suddenly get all this input that you would not have gotten, and completely different perspective than the one you brought from your own experience, right? I think the more that VCs and lawmakers and everybody else can try to replicate this, and especially to reach out to people whose lived experience is being impacted by all of this right now, like the artists, or like the people who are whose resumes are screened out by some AI tool, or that will really help us make sure that it's built for the benefit of human beings, as opposed to, many times unintentionally or with the best intentions, actually harming people, right? For a while, some countries were deploying AI and continue to deploy AI in the criminal justice system, thinking that it's going to be more objective than humans. And it turns out, no, it's humans all the way down, and it's not more objective. And now you're doing what critics are calling bias laundering, right? And again, with the best of intentions to try to improve things. So I think when you have the kind of conversations that you're calling for, just asking people, how do we make sure that this is actually good for society and for human beings, is a novel thing that's not happening enough.
Thank you very much for a comprehensive response. Minda, I would love for you to comment on the venture perspective on how do we take this in a good direction?
Well, I think, there's a concept of due diligence that we as investors perform on every deal we look at. And one of the things I heard one of the founders say that we brought in to talk to my class, he's a CTO of an AI company. And he said what he's really hoping, because we had an ethical discussion as a component of it, and he was just lit up to talk about that. He was so excited that someone wanted to engage on that, because he has a vision of, on a technology side, that just like they do tests of individual units of code, these unit tests and then system tests and things like that, that there's an ethical layer of testing that goes in parallel with the development of any AI solution. And so that it's not just at the end that we figure out that it's biased, it's that we are to be able to see like where everything is checking correctly and then where it starts to go awry, right? So can we build and architect our solutions such that they can be, that there's an ethical sort of side check that goes along as these technologies are getting developed, that then a venture capitalist can due diligence on to say, are we going to get funding for something that then is going to fly in the face of regulations in policy and law? Or can you show me the sort of audit trail of ethics testing and regulation testing or whatever it is? Right now it's ethics because we're way ahead of law and regulation. So we're really just relying on ethics. But can we have something that accompanies the building of technology that then can be sort of referenced back for investors like me who don't want to invest in something that's going to have a destructive consequence, or frankly, from a commercialization perspective, sort of wreck the investment?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. Add ethical dimensions to the diligence process. I really like it. David, would you like to comment on what industry players can do to mitigate the risks and try to take this in the right direction?
Yeah, I think we need to be having more conversations around what it is that we want to do and what it is that we don't want to do. And I think we've been talking about that now, and ultimately people are now mostly interested in what they can do and not having the conversations around, what do we want to do as a society? What do we want to have happen? And what problems are we actually trying to solve for people who want those problems to be solved? And so we're just going down this rabbit hole right now of just building everything as fast as possible. And I think we're not having enough conversations. And that's the biggest thing I think that the industry is just not doing right now. We started to force them to do it. We have some people that have been trying to have those conversations through legal means or otherwise. But until that reaches a head, I think right now it's very difficult to stop the machine when there's all this money just pouring into these companies. And I think until that reaches a head, either from a legal perspective or otherwise, it's just going to keep, unfortunately, I think, getting worse. But that's the thing that I feel like we need to be doing as industries, just keep talking to people. We talk to musicians all the time to understand what their feelings are around this and how they deal with generative AI and what they perceive to be the problems and the potential consequences for them. And I think people need to be having those conversations more with who their stakeholders are for their particular use case, and broader at large, we need to be having those larger conversations as a society before we get, like, we were talking, a lot of senators were talking about the mistakes we made with social media and how we didn't have conversations early on enough to prevent a lot of the problems that ended up coming up as a result of sort of the proliferation of social media and the laws that protect social media companies from all consequences, regardless of what happens on their platforms. And we're not really having those conversations fast enough right now when it comes to generative AI, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Hopefully, it happens sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. This comes together into a pretty interesting picture where academics are often asked in some conferences, you have to add a little ethics section, considering the ethical implications of your research. And then you have some investors and entrepreneurs who have a lot of power and money, not even sort of considering ethics as part of the formula. It's a very lopsided picture. So I'd love to give Mike a chance to wrap up this particular question, thinking what we can do on the academic side.
I think the interesting thing about the introduction of ethics statements in the papers is that there was a huge backlash from a lot of kind of right-wing academics in the AI space, of which there are many who kind of just didn't want that stuff. They thought it wasn't necessary. I think the last couple of years, I've felt that there's kind of been a shift when, I think I said it before, we're kind of we've passed the age of conversation. It is, in my opinion, it's too late for most regulation to have any impact unless the EU does something nuclear like they did with GDPR that completely disrupts the way that people operate. I think companies like OpenAI have too much of a grip. So what we need to do is we need to think, well, what does resistance look like? What are the things that we can do? What are the ways we can put ourselves on the line a bit more? A stakeholder I should have mentioned when I was listing names was Timnit Gebru, who did put her career on the line, who sacrificed a lot to stand up and whistleblow and talk about things that she thought were important. And I think we all need to ask ourselves in academia, like, could we be doing a bit more, or could we be doing different things? We have a lot of power that other people don't have. We can say things that other people can't say. We can get funding, which doesn't have as many strings attached to it. And that funding is not as big as the funding that, say, OpenAI is playing with, but we can do very powerful things with it. We can work with independent groups. We can work with people that don't normally get access to money at all. And I think everyone here has talked about, think who your stakeholders are. And when we're doing that, ask yourselves, like, how many of them are Black? How many of them are working class? How many of them are from the global South? Like, where are your blind spots? Where are the groups that we're not considering? Where's a lot of this hidden labor taking place? Where's the impact going to be? And I think all of us need to take more risks, do things that make us uncomfortable. And I'm not saying I'm doing that, by the way. I'm not doing anywhere near enough. We all need to keep doing more of it, but it's a crucial time, and a lot of damage has already been done. You mentioned this right up front, Maya. We're at a point now where the internet is now flooded with generated content. We are past that watershed. We will never go back. It is not possible to. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what can we do to mitigate damage, to spread awareness, to help other people defend themselves against the changes that are coming, and to have the knowledge to protect themselves in the future.
Yeah, these are excellent points. Thank you so much. I do find that all of us come with a surprising amount of power if we want to focus on making a difference. All right, so we have time for questions. So let's get started. Joao, appreciate your help.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, cool. Just about what you were mentioning right now, I was thinking a bit about democratizing science and AI and AI literacy and all of that. And well, it came to mind the idea of open science in a sense, and how to balance open science with company secrets and company intellectual property. How can you balance that? Should companies open their secrets for everyone to know what's happening, and how to profit on that? Yeah.
That's an industry-focused question.
Yeah, I mean, I find that a very interesting question. I don't know if this is directed at me, but Yeah, I think that the tricky part when you're dealing with AI in general, when it in this particular, wave, I guess you would call it, of generative AI, is the idea of, should I publish stuff open source, or should I keep it closed behind a wall? And I really think it kind of depends, right? It depends on its use. It depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're trying to build some of these more foundational models, I think an open source approach, generally speaking, is the right way to go. And I think the way that you then build a moat, so to speak, around how you're going to make money is what you're going to do with it on top of it. How are you going to use it in an actual innovative way? And how are you going to build systems around it that are going to make the interaction with it unique and are going to make the interaction with it useful for somebody, right? Because you can use these models in any number of ways. You can use them for very destructive means. You can use them in very human-centric ways. And the way that you choose to build that system is going to be entirely uniquely driven by your perspective and the perspective of the people that you're interacting with and you're talking to. And I think it's okay to have these big models be open source, because ultimately that lets more people fool around with them and figure out, how biased are they? What are the problems with these models? If people can't see them, if everything is closed, like GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, if all these things are closed, you can't figure out, at least not without a lot of resources and a lot of time, how badly is this thing made? Like, what is the data set exactly that went into this? They're not going to tell you, because they have a lot of vested interest. Who are the people that are labeling all the data and doing the human reinforcement learning that's part of this model? We found out that they're not paid very well, and there's a lot of like bad things that are happening there. So the open source side of it, I find, from these larger models, is a good way of making sure that we can test these systems. We can figure out where the flaws are. Because if we can't figure those things out, then ultimately we're going down a rabbit hole where at the end of the day, we don't even know what we're going to end up with. And you can find other ways. You can definitely, as a company, an entrepreneur is trying to build a company, you can definitely find other ways of building a moat, building your own IP internally, even though you're using these foundational models. And at the end of the day, I do believe that once you've prototyped something and built something with these models, you can fine tune and build smaller models that do the things that you're interested in, that are geared towards that specific task, that are much more environmentally friendly, much cheaper to iterate on. You're starting to build data sets then with your users and starting to get like a more and more refined model. And that's then where you have your advantage over time, as you have more and more people interacting and you're getting more and more into what the actual problem is and how do I actually use these things to solve it. And that's where I think things should go, and I'm hoping that that's actually what things end up happening.
Thank you.
I want to, can I respond briefly, because I think open source is really important, and I think AI literacy is really important, but I want to speak on behalf of all the people like myself who will never look under the hood of an AI model and tinker with it. And that for many people like me, and many others who are even less focused on AI than I am, they're concerned about lots of other things. So the term democratizing something gets you at a certain subset of the demographic and democratic group. And beyond that, that's where we need regulations to protect everybody else, in the same way that we haven't democratized food safety, but we have certain expectations, right? That when you go to a restaurant, you're not testing your own food. We need that for a lot of these products as well.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, I think actually the food one is interesting. We have labels for all of our food, right? There's certain things that have to happen in order for you to make a decision about what you're going to eat. So that's really interesting. By open source, I think the important part there is that then it lets people in academia get access to it who can look at this in a very scrutinizing way and say things that people in industry sometimes, like Mike was saying earlier, can't.
I was really hoping to take a few questions if possible. How many questions are there in total? Can we see a show of hands just so we can? Okay, so just a little bit. We're very good on time. All right, let's go over there.
Hey, thank you. This question is probably for David or Minda, but let's say you have a generative AI idea that you find interesting and you think could be a commercial application. As an individual or small team, how do you approach the industry or investors to find out if that idea is helpful and could be either accepted, or maybe people are scared of it, and also something that might be able to be invested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I probably encounter that on a daily basis. But I would say as a very early stage investor, I'm not as interested in what I think as I am in what someone who will pay for it thinks. So that's like, I would literally turn you back around and push you back out into the real world to find out who's interested and would pay for what you are doing. And then that presents a case to me for investment later. And so to me, listening too much to and building for what investors think people want is not a great way to build something innovative, because we're not the innovators. We are simply funding innovation that's coming from founders who have a unique observation or insight about how to do something. So that's a lot of times what I end up doing is just turning someone out and say, come back when you've talked to people who want this too.
I have an interesting Sorry, what's that, Maya?
I believe you actually include that in your diligence process.
Yes,
And, so you're very serious about this, which
I am.
Yeah, I think from my perspective too, just prototyping it and seeing who's going to use this system and finding who it is that you can talk to see whether they're interested in what you're trying to build and whether that's an actual solution that people care about. And whether they're willing to pay for it would be to prototype it. But I think it's really difficult from an entrepreneur's perspective sometimes after you've done that aspect of it, of figuring out if you go too far afield outside of what VCs are currently comfortable with, I find there's a lot of pushback. So it is a fine line to walk. Right now, if you're in the generative AI space, you're not outside their comfort zone. They're all comfortable suddenly with generative AI. But going back, when we started our company in 2017, nobody cared about generative AI. We were doing something very innovative, and ultimately, a lot of people were just like, no one's ever going to use this, right? Because no one had the foresight to see where this was going, and so it can be difficult. Even after we had paying users, even after we had people asking us constantly to use our systems and things like this, it wasn't enough because it was so outside the norm of what they were used to seeing that it was like, well, I don't see any other companies that are doing this. I don't know how to invest in this. And so that can be difficult. It's a difficult problem. And I don't think there's any like easy or nonstop solution to just do this, but yeah.
Yeah. And I do think that goes back to getting a wider range of perspectives in who have capital in their hands to allocate.
I think that also explains why Yoko and Minda were early investors in generative AI, having a very consumer-focused attitude. Unfortunately, a lot of venture happens based on sort of less of a different processes. All right, I believe we had another question from Juliana.
First off, thanks for putting together such an insightful panel. I think it's so important to bring these diverse perspectives so we can understand the codependency of relationships and disciplines here. A question I had is, how do you think generative AI affects human relationships? And building off of that, what are some things that stand out to you on what we could learn from the CC's established history to help cultivate experiences with generative AI technologies that will help increase human relationships?
Great question. I love that, because at the end of the day, like, we've been talking so much about individuals and not as much about people and how technology is between people. So what I would hope is that it doesn't create more isolation and sort of free us up to be busier somehow. Because I think that's when we suffer, when we don't have the space in our lives to sort of have lots of human interaction. So I don't want it to isolate us. I don't want us to make us busier. So it's the things that allow us to do the work that we want to do as humans, whether that is but sometimes it's emotional work, sometimes it's creative work, sometimes, whatever it is, everybody should get to decide for themselves what work they want to do that brings them joy in their lives. And certainly that's relationships. I just don't want it to get in the way of that just by making the world move faster. That's not going to help us. So I do hope we get more opportunity to be less isolated.
I think there's a lot of concern that it's already started to disrupt human relationships. I know people who say they use ChatGPT to write their emails. I know people who use it to read their emails. Google's own advertising for Bard suggests that it can help you write an invite to a barbecue. So in many ways, the stated purpose of some of this technology is to disrupt the way we communicate with one another. And I think it's a challenge.
Yes, but if everybody comes to your barbecue, you get to talk to them.
I mean, right now, maybe, unless we find a way to automate that away as well. I don't know. It depends if Google thinks they can make a quick buck out of doing it. But I think it's our responsibility to find more human ways to use this technology. And the analogy I always use, and which many of us use, is of photography. Photography was something that was only accessible to rich chemists, basically, until it became something that everyone could use. And then journalists found ways to use it, doctors found ways to use it, scientists found ways to use it. And it became something else. It became something entirely new. And so I think what we're waiting for, hopefully, is to put it in the hands of everyone, of artists. So there's someone I know who, I'm going to call them Cheese Talk because that's what they're called on Twitter. That's not their real human name, but they're an artist at the Royal College of Art, and they use generative AI to make really interesting interactive experiments on Discord that people can talk to. And yeah, I think we just need to put the technology in more hands like that.
And I think we have to be wary of the various attempts to use this to quote unquote cure loneliness, because I keep seeing chatbots that are supposed to somehow make you feel less lonely because you don't have anybody to talk to, but you can talk to, and then again, the more realistic they sound, the more people end up bonding with some of these assistants. And so I feel like I'm totally not qualified to talk about that. We need a psychologist on this panel to talk about that, but that is something that is happening that is impacting human relationships. And again, this is why we need to have these very multifaceted conversations with people with lots of background knowledge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think long term also there's this idea of as AI gets more and more and more advanced, as I'm kind of going outside the generative AI sphere at this particular point, but as it sort of swallows up more and more jobs, or either that or tries to make people more productive by making them busier. But essentially you're offloading all these tasks. We're hiring less people as a result because you're doing more and we don't need more people. That's going to have a massive impact economically and socially on our country. And I think there's nobody is prepared for that. Nobody right now is talking about it. Nobody's prepared for the idea of what happens, 10 years from now when all truck drivers are out of work. That's a huge number of people. And what are they going to do with their lives? I mean, at that particular point, we don't have a very, robust education system in the United States that can re-educate such a large number of people. They can't necessarily afford to do that themselves. There's a lot of things coming down the path, I think, that we need to be very careful about. And I don't think we're having enough conversations around.
Yeah, excellent final point here. I'd like to very sincerely thank all of our panelists for bringing together different perspectives in sort of a real symphony of different points of view that came together so beautifully, hopefully inspiring us to have more conversations with stakeholders who are not exactly in our field and outside of academia in general. So let's give a huge round of applause to our panelists. All right, thank you very much. We're going to wrap up here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Pleasure to listen to all of your perspectives.
Cheers, everyone.